Hello readers, this is Professor Mario Molina, a scientist who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. Now I'm going to use the example of Professor Molina to teach us about connections, or drawing connections between scientific information in a text, in a piece of writing. Because reading scientific papers often involves learning about a bunch of new information all at once, and then learning how all of that new information connects. How is information connected? Before we dive into Dr. Molina's life and research, let's use a simple example. A bowl of noodles, say. Let's put a little sauce on those noodles, maybe a little bit of pesto. Just a little bit of green, a little bit of basil. Here's a basil leaf. So, using this bowl of pasta as an example. In a piece of nonfiction, we can learn why something happened. We can learn why the pasta was made. You know, maybe I was hungry. We can learn how something happened. So in the case of the pasta, I cooked it in boiling water and then drained it and put some sauce on top and put it in a bowl. We can learn how one event impacted other events. Let's say I had a very late lunch at like 4 p.m. that consisted of this pasta, and then by 7 p.m. when it was time for me to have dinner, I didn't have as much of an appetite because I'd spoiled my appetite with this big old bowl of pasta at 4. And we can also learn how events cause other events. So say I'd had my late lunch of pasta, and I wasn't ready for dinner at 7, so I decided to push dinner back a couple of hours. That's, I'm an adult. I eat when I want. Now, I know this example is a little silly, but I wanted to talk about something relatively simple, like a bowl of noodles, before we dive into Dr. Molina and his research, which is about pretty complicated scientific concepts. So these are just 4 of the ways that information can be connected. These aren't the only 4 ways, these aren't the only ways to think about information, but these are some of them, and this is a helpful way to think about making connections when you're reading. So this is taken from a passage on the website about Mario Molina's research. I'm going to read this passage, and as I do, I'm going to try and find connections between pieces of information in the text. I'm going to try and pull out of the passage the stuff that the author wants me to know, and the stuff that the author wants me to put together. As a professor, Mario Molina tackled a question that no other scientist had before. It was, how do chlorofluorocarbons, what a long word, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, affect the atmosphere? Now this is interesting because these are parentheses, and the parentheses are telling us that CFC is a shorter way to refer to chlorofluorocarbon, which I'm going to assume is some kind of chemical. And how do they affect the atmosphere? So what is the impact of these CFCs on the atmosphere? And specifically sentences like these that are built up like this, right? So the passage is setting up the idea that no other scientist had ever asked this question, or hadn't successfully managed to deal with it, tackled it, right? What is the impact of these CFCs on the atmosphere? And if you don't know a word like atmosphere, now is a really good time to look it up, right? The atmosphere is the layer of air and gases that surrounds the rocky part of our planet. So we can just say the air, just sort of as a rough definition. So how do CFCs affect the air? And so now we've been cued to look for some sort of cause-effect relationship. Now we've been cued for some sort of relationship between CFCs and the atmosphere. They affect it somehow. They do something to it. Let's keep reading. CFCs are chemicals, great, once used to cool refrigerators. Okay. So this is starting to answer my next question, like what are CFCs? They were also used in things like hairspray. So hairspray and refrigerators. Now, I don't use a lot of hairspray, but I do have a refrigerator in my home, which leads me to think that CFCs used to be pretty common. That's what these 2 sentences together tell me. I also keyed in on the word once here, which suggests to me that they used to cool refrigerators, and they used to be used in things like hairspray, but I don't think that they are anymore, probably because of Molina's research. At this time, in the 1970s, the public believed that CFCs were safe to use. Alright, so now I know when this research is taking place is in the 1970s. This also kind of explains the hairspray thing. If you've ever seen a movie from the 70s, people had a much, much, much bigger hair than they do today. So we know that in the 70s, the public, like everybody, believed that CFCs were safe. However, love a however, Molina discovered something else. Something else other than what? Well, because of where this transition is, it's in the next paragraph, and it's kind of reflecting back on the previous sentence, I think we can say that something else is that CFCs were maybe not so safe to use. Something else was true. After release, CFCs rise up into the Earth's atmosphere. There, solar radiation breaks them down into something called chlorine. Chlorine destroys the ozone layer, which shields Earth from the sun's harmful rays. Alright, so that's a lot of information all at once, and that's a lot of relationships of information all at once. So we've got our little can of hairspray. There it goes. And after it's used, it rises up into the atmosphere where rays from the sun hit it, and that breaks it down into chlorine. And chlorine destroys the ozone layer, which protects us from the harmful rays of the sun. So let's go back to our pasta bowl, and instead of pasta, scribble that out and replace it with the destruction of the ozone layer in the 70s. So why did it happen? And the answer to that is CFCs got into the atmosphere. I'm just going to write CFCs atmo. How did something happen? Well, when the CFCs get hit by solar radiation, they turn into chlorine, and the chlorine eats the ozone layer. And what is the impact of the ozone layer being destroyed? More exposure to solar radiation. And what caused this to happen? The use of CFCs in hairspray and refrigerators. So when you're trying to make connections in a scientific text, ask yourself these questions. Why did something happen? How did it happen? What are the impacts from that thing happening? And does it cause anything else to happen? Taking the information from a text and then kind of plugging it into these questions or these thoughts is a great way to figure out how information relates to other information within that passage and how it relates to stuff you may already know about. So we say, thank you, Dr. Molina, for saving the ozone layer. You can learn anything. David out. Hello readers, today I'm going to be talking about text features, which is to say the parts of a text that aren't just words. We look at text features to get a better understanding of what the text is all about. Although they're not words, like I said, text features help our reading comprehension. So what's a good example of a text feature? Well, let's start with, say, a map. Maps are a great example of a feature of the text that isn't made up of words. So this is a social studies textbook. This section is about Egypt. I've turned to this page where there is a map. What is this map of? Well, we can look at this part here. This text here over on the side is a caption. It's something that can tell us about an image. And the map is labeled, so it's about the Nile River and how the Nile River is fed from rainfall to the south, the water travels to the north. Here's Egypt up here. Don't focus too much on the details of this being about the Nile and stuff. Really what we're talking about is here is an image, there is a caption next to the image. Reading the caption helps us understand what's in the image, and looking at the image helps us understand what's in the caption. So we've got maps, we've got images, and that can be illustrations, photos, blueprints, anything really. And if we go back to our social studies textbook, we can see here there's this image. And just looking at the image on its own, we might not be able to tell what that is exactly. But again, there is another helpful little caption over to the side that says this is an aerial view of the Nile. So now we know what this is. And that can help ground us as we go through the rest of the text, which is also, I assume, about the Nile River and ancient Egypt. The caption and its picture are two halves of a whole. They're both helping you understand the other. Other useful text features include charts, diagrams, and graphs, which can include things like timelines. This page here has a table. You can see up at the top, this top row is labeled Ancient Egypt, and then on the left we have all the different periods of Egyptian history, and on the right, all the dates associated with those periods. There's also a timeline in this lesson, and this one has a bunch of different text elements, right? So we have, it's not a traditional looking timeline, but you can see that it's arranged from top to bottom, oldest to most recent. Those are just some of the many options that are available to you when you look at a text. Remember that when you're reading a passage, it's not just the words, it's everything on the page. Sometimes I even like to familiarize myself with the charts or the diagrams or the images on the page before I start reading, before I really get down to the business of reading the paragraphs, because that helps me get rooted. It helps me anchor myself in what the text is going to be about. I look at the pictures, I skim the captions just to say, okay, what's going on here? Cool, we're talking about rivers, we're talking about ancient Egypt, I'm ready. And building those skills of readiness and being able to anchor yourself in any text that you encounter is what's going to make you a strong reader. You can learn anything. David out. Hello readers, today we're going to talk about making connections. So, I don't mean to brag, but I have at least one friend. I'm kind of a big deal. I have friends at work, friends from the schools I attended, friends in my apartment building in my neighborhood, friends from places I used to live. Each friend is connected to me in some way. Maybe we met in the elevator, or on the train, or at the community garden. In some cases, I introduced my friends, and now they're friends with each other, and even hang out without me. Each friend is connected to me or to each other in a different way, and for a different reason. And just in the way that people can be friends with each other, ideas can be friends with each other too. Understanding how ideas in a text connect to each other and to the topic of the text will help me understand what I'm reading. Good readers make connections between ideas in a text. When I look at a passage, I ask myself, what do all these sentences have in common? How are they connected? Let's explain with a brief passage about building ships. Long ago, shipbuilders used iron nails and bolts because iron was easy to find. They soon learned the disadvantages of using this metal on a boat. Iron quickly rusts and decays, especially near the salty ocean. They switched to using brass, which lasts longer. I want to use this paragraph to describe 3 common ways authors show connections: comparison, cause and effect, and sequence. Comparison. What's the same or different between two ideas? So what's similar between brass and iron is one example. We can say, okay, both of these are metals and both were used in shipbuilding. Now what's different between them? Well, iron rusts quickly in the ocean, and it does so faster than brass, right? Brass lasts longer. Now let's talk about cause and effect. How does one event or idea cause another event or idea? Well, what happens when you put a ship with iron bolts into salt water? It rusts and decays. The ocean causes the iron to corrode and rust. So what did shipbuilders do as a result? They switched to using brass. And finally, sequence. What order did things happen in? Now the paragraph begins with long ago and talks about iron before it talks about brass. It then describes how shipbuilders switched to brass, so iron came first in the sequence. So when I read this passage on shipbuilding, even though it is very short, I'm able to make a lot of connections between ideas. Doing this deepened my understanding and helps me to become a better reader. Now, not every sentence or idea is connected to every other sentence or idea. Just like not every single one of my friends is friends with all of my other friends. And that's okay too. Our goal is to think about how those sentences connect to the topic overall. Think about the big picture. Understanding the connections between sentences is one of many ways you can strengthen your skills as a reader. You can learn anything. David out. Hello, readers. Today I'd like to talk to you about the moral of the story. Which story? Well, we'll get to that. First, what is a moral? It's a lesson, usually about how you're supposed to treat other people. I think we can say that if a story has a moral, it's trying to teach you how to be a good person. Aesop's fables are full of these. There's the story of the tortoise and the hare, which I'll tell you very quickly if you're unfamiliar. The slow-moving tortoise and the speedy hare have a foot race, and the hare is so sure that she'll beat the tortoise that she stops to take a nap during the race. Meanwhile, the tortoise slowly and steadily continues onwards and crosses the finish line while the hare is sleeping. That's confetti as the tortoise crosses the finish line. The moral of the story is slow and steady wins the race. You can beat an overconfident person even if they're more talented than you if you try really hard and take it slow but steady. But it's not just old stories from ancient Greece that have morals. The stories around us are full of lessons about how to treat one another. So, how do you figure out what the moral of a story is? Good question. One way to do it is to ask yourself what the problem of the story is, or how the problem was solved. From the hare's perspective, the problem in the tortoise and the hare is that she lost the race. What could she have done to avoid that happening? Well, she probably shouldn't have stopped to take a nap. From the tortoise's perspective, the problem is solved. He won the race. And how did he do that? By maintaining a slow, steady pace for the whole race. And then you take that lesson that the characters learned, and you say, okay, so this is true for everyone. It's not just that hares should make sure not to nap during foot races, it's that people who are good at stuff shouldn't get so confident about their skills that they don't try as hard. The hare is really good at running quickly, so she thinks she doesn't need to try so hard against a tortoise. Because that is what morals do. They are lessons in stories that we can apply to our lives. What's true for the hare and what's true for the tortoise are true for you and me. Because those stories were invented to teach people stories, not just tortoises and hares. You can learn anything. David out. Hello, readers. Today we're going to talk about mind reading. Ooh! Also known as understanding a character's thoughts and feelings. I'm kind of serious here. One of the things that I think is magical about reading books and stories is that they let you see what characters are thinking and feeling. Sometimes a story takes you inside the mind of a character in a story. Here's what it sounds like when a character tells you the story herself.
It was a rainy, miserable night in the town of Roseville. My coffee cooled rapidly in the evening air. I watched Johnny Flamingo, the Duke of Crime, walk confidently across the parking lot. I hated him. "I'm gonna get you, Johnny," I muttered. "I'm gonna get you for doing all those crimes."
So how does this character feel about Johnny Flamingo? She hates him. How do we know? She told us so. Sometimes it's not a character who tells you what they're thinking or feeling, but instead it's a narrator who knows how those characters feel. And that can sound like this.
Standing on a hill outside her little village, Lana looked to the sky and the dragons that flew through the clouds in lazy circles. "I will learn to ride a dragon," she thought. "I promise."
What does Lana want to learn to do? Ride dragons. Did she tell us? No, not exactly. But the narrator did, by listening to her thoughts. Do you see what I'm saying? It's magical, this ability to read a character's mind in a story. If I had the power to fully hear my friend's thoughts, I don't think we'd ever have any kind of misunderstandings ever again. How a character thinks or feels about something is important evidence that helps explain why they act the way they do. Now, it's possible to have a feeling or a thought but still do something opposite. Like a character could be afraid of heights but still climb a tree to rescue a cat. Or it's possible for a character to feel multiple conflicting emotions or thoughts at the same time, just like it's possible for you or me to feel embarrassed and proud at the same time, or happy and regretful. Let's take a look at this example.
"It's not so bad," said Zeke, examining it closely when he saw my frown. "It's a bowling pin, right?" I tried to remain calm, but I was totally frustrated. I spent all that time, and Zeke thought my statue was a bowling pin? I gritted my teeth as I forced a smile. No, not exactly, but it's not quite done yet. I grabbed the sculpture and headed to my room. I was determined to make Lady Liberty recognizable. I decided to watch a video on how to make realistic faces in clay. It was helpful. Although it took me a while, I finally made some improvements to my work of art.
See how the narrator says they're frustrated, but they don't show it to Zeke. They force themselves to smile and not display their frustration. They're trying to be calm, but inside, they're totally frustrated. So I guess the lesson here is that the magic of mind reading is only part of the story. You have to go by how characters in a story act, too. But we'll talk about that in another video. You can learn anything. David out. Hello readers, I'm going to draw you a map right now, and it's going to look like I've drawn a mountain. But it's not a map of a mountain, it's a map of a story. What? You're saying, how do you map a story? What makes a story pointy? These are great questions, and to answer them, I'll say this. Today we're going to talk about the elements of a story, or the parts that make it up, like ingredients in a recipe. Many stories follow a similar pattern. Good readers know what these patterns are and can talk about them using the right terms, and this helps everyone be on the same page, so to speak, when you discuss or write about the stories you read. I'm about to drop a lot of vocabulary on you, so brace yourselves. The story begins with exposition, where we learn about the characters and the setting. Then we introduce a conflict, or a big problem. As the characters begin to interact with the conflict or try to solve the problem, we enter rising action, this upward slope of the story mountain. When the conflict comes to a head, we hit the most exciting part of the story, the climax. Here, the conflict can't go any further. We're at the top of the mountain. There's nowhere else to go except down. After the climax, after this most exciting part of the story, we enter falling action. The climax will happen much closer to the end of the story than to the middle. It's not a symmetrical mountain. The action slows down, the problem has been solved, or maybe the problem has changed, and the characters prepare for the last phase of story, the resolution. This is where we tie up loose ends, characters reflect on what they learned, maybe you set up a sequel. Now, look, that was a lot of information all at once. In order to make sense of it, let's apply all of those terms to a story. Now, our go-to has been The Three Little Pigs, and while that's a story everyone knows, I'm starting to think it needs to be freshened up a little bit, really work on its franchise potential, you know? So let's go through the elements of story by looking at my new project, a reboot of Three Little Pigs, that I'm calling TLP Starbound. See, it's Three Little Pigs, but it's in space. That's a space helmet. So I'm going to put a little story map here in the corner. Okay, so, the exposition. It's the future. Pigs have expanded to every corner of the galaxy. 3 brave little pigs decide to strike out on their own, exploring a new, exciting region of space. 1 builds a spaceship out of straw. Go with me here. 1 builds a spaceship out of twigs. And 1 builds a spaceship out of a flexible hyperalloy they developed in a laboratory. She's the brainy pig. So, we've got the setting. It's the future, they're in space. We've got our characters, the pigs. Now, the conflict. Along comes the notorious space pirate, Captain Wolf. He's big, he's bad. He wants to blow up the spaceships and eat the pigs. He begins hunting down the pig ships one at a time. I think Captain Wolf has an eye patch. No, he has a cyber eye. He's part robot. And now we enter our rising action phase. Captain Wolf engages the straw ship. They have an exciting space battle. And Straw Pig escapes in a little escape pod to the twig ship. But Captain Wolf follows. He is undaunted. The tension continues to rise. He destroys the twig ship. The 2 pigs escape again, this time to the brick house. The hot, flexible hyperalloy spaceship piloted by the science pig. And now we come to the climax. Captain Wolf comes to the advanced ship. He tries to blow it up, but he can't. It's too powerful. He decides to board the ship, because that's the only way he'll get to eat the pigs, but the pigs trap him in a space barrel while he's still in the airlock. They did it! They solved the problem. Captain Wolf is strapped in a space barrel, and he can't eat them now. The climax is past, and now we enter the falling action phase of the story. In the version of the story that I know, the three little pigs roll the barrel into the river. So I think maybe in this version they punt the space barrel out the airlock into the cold void of space. Or maybe they strand him on a deserted planet. But in any case, they never have to deal with the wolf again. The threat is now gone, and that means that the conflict has been resolved. We're in the resolution part of the story now. The first two little pigs, the straw ship pig and the twig ship pig, learn that they need to put more work into their spaceships if they want to survive in space, and they build fancy spaceships just like the science pig. And that's an introduction to story elements. Now that you're familiar with the ideas, start applying them to your favorite stories. You can do this with any form of media: books, comics, TV shows, movies, games. What's the conflict? How is it resolved? Once you start looking for story structure in entertainment, you will find it everywhere. Let us know what you see. You can learn anything. David out. Hello, readers. Today, I want to talk all about me. Well, I want to talk about three things. First, I want to talk all about me. Then I'm going to talk about you. And then we're going to talk about them. David, what are you talking about? You're probably asking. Well, in a word, POV. In 3 words, point of view. Every story has a point of view. It's being told to us by someone, a narrator. But who is that narrator? Understanding the answer to that question in the stories that you read will make you a strong reader. There are 3 different flavors of point of view: first, second, and third person. First person is when the narrator is a character in the story. They use words like I, me, and my. Here's an example. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my backpack, and rushed out the door. Today was the day I was finally going to learn to ride a horse. First-person narrators can only tell us the parts of the story that they experienced or already know about. If something happens that the narrator doesn't know about, we, the reader, won't know about it either. Second person is when you are a character in the story. This is pretty rare. A lot of the choose-your-own-adventure books that were popular when I was a kid use second-person point of view, but they're not as big as they used to be. Imagine a guided relaxation recording when you think of second person. You are calm. Your breathing is slow and even. You are sitting on a bench, looking at the ocean. The ocean is calm, and so are you. This kind of point of view usually sounds like it's giving directions to you, the reader. The most common point of view in stories is the third person, a narrator who isn't a character in the story. A third-person narrator uses words like he, she, and they for characters in the story, instead of I or you. It lets the storyteller get inside the heads of characters to see how they're feeling, or what they're thinking. Here's an example. Benny opened his closet door to grab a jacket, only to be greeted by a horrifying monster. He screamed and ran out of the room, scared out of his mind. Inside her monster costume, Rita giggled. She had tricked her brother. See how we can follow both Rita and Benny? The narrator can see what both of them are thinking or feeling at the same time. Now imagine if that little snippet were told from Rita or Benny's first-person perspectives, Rita using I or Benny using I, instead of a third-person POV using he or she. We might see it differently reading that story. From Rita's perspective, it's a funny prank. From Benny's, it's super scary. He just saw a monster. So, to recap, there are 3 different types of narration or points of view in a story. First person, the narrator is a character inside the story and uses words like I or me. Second person, the narrator is speaking directly to you, the reader, and uses the pronoun you. This is rare, and it sounds like it's giving directions. And third person, the narrator is outside the story. In telling it, they use words like he, she, and they. What's the POV of your favorite story? Is it first person, second, or third? How would it feel different if it were told from a different point of view? Would the narrator know different things? I can tell you one thing I know for certain, and that's that you can learn anything. David out. Hello, readers. You know that feeling when you're reading and you see a word you've never seen before and you don't really know how to figure out what it means? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Strategies for figuring out new words through context. You're always going to be encountering new words. At the time of this recording, I'm 31, and I run into new and confusing words every day. I read a lot, and it's always a fun challenge to run into words like, I don't know, glabrous, or limbed, or nacreous. I know a lot about language, and even I have trouble figuring out what those words mean on their own. So it's important to rely on context, the language that surrounds the word. Let's say you're reading a text and you come across a sentence that has a word in it you don't recognize. Here's a bit from a passage about the famous chimpanzee researcher Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall arrived at Tanzania's Gombe Stream National Park in 1960. She was considered somewhat unconventional among other animal researchers. After all, she had not yet been to college. So let's pause on unconventional. What does that word mean? Well, let me give you some ideas. That's the memory aid I use to keep it straight. Ideas. It stands for inference, definition, example, antonym, synonym. IDEAS, ideas, which are all different kinds of context clues. Every word will have a different context, so you might need to vary your approach. The way this snippet is written, let's try inference first. Then I'll rewrite the sentence a few times to show you the other methods. Okay, the I in ideas, inference. We can draw conclusions from the context. If we don't know what unconventional means, we can take a look at the rest of the sentence or other nearby sentences to figure it out. Being unconventional seems to make Goodall different from other researchers. She hadn't yet been to college, which implies that the rest of them had. That doesn't give us a full answer, but it does tell us that she's different somehow. So I think that unconventional might mean different than what is normal. And because I'm making an inference about this word's meaning, I want to keep an eye out for it in other places to see if I can confirm or revise that working definition later. D. Definition. Context clues like these will just give you the definition of the word in question. So a good example of that would be, she was considered somewhat unconventional among other animal researchers. She hadn't been to college yet, and this made her different and unexpected. Different and unexpected is a great definition for the word unconventional. This style of context clue occurs when the author expects a word to be unfamiliar to you and builds in a guide for you right there in the text. The E in ideas stands for example, and this is somewhere between inference and definition. If the author describes Goodall as unconventional, they'll go on to talk about something unconventional that Goodall did. She was considered somewhat unconventional among animal researchers. For one thing, she hadn't been to college yet. So this is very similar to that initial sentence, except for the transition phrase, for one thing, which is a way to set up examples. Antonym. An antonym is a word whose meaning is the opposite of another word, like how night is the opposite of day, or how love is the opposite of hate. So if there's an example in the text of what Jane Goodall was not, we can use that to figure out what she was. So let's say the passage said, Goodall was unconventional, she didn't conform, and she wasn't ordinary. There we have two antonyms and our answer. Similarly, synonym just means write another word with the same meaning, similar to a definition. Jane Goodall was unconventional. She was a nonconformist. She went against the grain. You can see that I had to rewrite the sentences each time to apply to each context clue strategy, which shows me that you won't find all 5 context clues every time you need to search for a word's meaning. You need to find the approach that makes the most sense in context. See what I did there? And failing that, you can always look up an unfamiliar word in a dictionary. I love to do that, I think that's great. But I also feel a sense of victory when I correctly figure out what a new word means, when I've put it together from context. And maybe if I'm still curious, I look it up later, and then I turn out to be right, and I'm all like, victory at sea! I did it! Oh, and if you were curious, glabrous means smooth and hairless, like a leaf or the skin of a frog. Nacreous means shiny and rainbow-colored, like the inside of an oyster shell. And to limn something means to draw the outline of, or to be highlighted in light. You can learn anything. David out. Hello readers! Today we're going to talk about things called affixes. One of the things that I love
Late one night, Milo the mouse sat on his windowsill. He stared at the moon. Its surface was full of craters. "That looks like cheese," said Milo, who couldn't see the moon very clearly. His stomach rumbled. He was awfully hungry. "I'm going to go to the moon and get some cheese," he declared. "Go to sleep, Milo," said his mother. So Milo went to sleep, and as he slept, he dreamed. Milo dreamed of flying to the moon on the back of a bird. Up and up they soared, until they landed on the moon. The moon was soft in parts, like cream cheese, and firm in parts, like cheddar, and even bouncy in parts, like mozzarella, and that part of the moon was Milo's favorite. He ate and ate all night. When Milo woke the next morning, he realized he had been chewing on his pillow, and not cheese. But he remembered his dream. He decided to go find a bird. Milo left the house, and ran into his friend Tiny, the squirrel. "Where are you going?" Tiny asked. "The moon," Milo replied. "The moon is made of cheese, and I'm hungry." Tiny laughed. "The moon isn't made of cheese. It's rocky and rough. It only looks smooth from here." "We'll see about that, Tiny. The next time you see me, I promise I'll have cheese," said Milo. Milo climbed the tallest hill in the forest and waved until a bird landed in front of him. "Hello," said Milo happily. "Would you take me to the moon, please?" The bird, who was an owl, looked at the hill. Then she craned her head up high to look at the sky. "I think that's further than I can fly, Milo," she said. "But I do have a way to see the moon up close without flying very far at all. It's called a telescope." When Milo looked through the telescope, he got a really good look at the moon. "Oh," said Milo. "It really isn't made of cheese after all." "Nope," said the owl. "It's made of rocks." "Well, where am I going to get some cheese?" Milo cried as he realized his misunderstanding. The owl moved the telescope with her wing, and Milo continued to look. "Oh my goodness," he said. "A cheese store." The owl peeked through the telescope. "It looks like they're having a sale on cheddar," she said. The bird, who was an owl, looked at the hill. Then she craned her head up high to look at the sky. "I think that's further than I can fly, Milo," she said. "But I do have a way to see the moon up close without flying very far at all. It's called a telescope." When Milo looked through the telescope, he got a really good look at the moon. "Oh," said Milo. "It really isn't made of cheese after all." "Nope," said the owl. "It's made of rocks." "Well, where am I going to get some cheese?" Milo cried as he realized his misunderstanding. The owl moved the telescope with her wing, and Milo continued to look. "Oh my goodness," he said. "A cheese store." The owl peeked through the telescope. "It looks like they're having a sale on cheddar," she said. Late one night, Milo the mouse sat on his windowsill. He stared at the moon. Its surface was full of craters. "That looks like cheese," said Milo, who couldn't see the moon very clearly. His stomach rumbled. He was awfully hungry. "I'm going to go to the moon and get some cheese," he declared. "Go to sleep, Milo," said his mother. So Milo went to sleep, and as he slept, he dreamed. Milo dreamed of flying to the moon on the back of a bird. Up and up they soared, until they landed on the moon. The moon was soft in parts, like cream cheese, and firm in parts, like cheddar, and even bouncy in parts, like mozzarella, and that part of the moon was Milo's favorite. He ate and ate all night. When Milo woke the next morning, he realized he had been chewing on his pillow, and not cheese. But he remembered his dream. He decided to go find a bird. Milo left the house, and ran into his friend Tiny, the squirrel. "Where are you going?" Tiny asked. "The moon," Milo replied. "The moon is made of cheese, and I'm hungry." Tiny laughed. "The moon isn't made of cheese. It's rocky and rough. It only looks smooth from here." "We'll see about that, Tiny. The next time you see me, I promise I'll have cheese," said Milo. Milo climbed the tallest hill in the forest and waved until a bird landed in front of him. "Hello," said Milo happily. "Would you take me to the moon, please?" The bird, who was an owl, looked at the hill. Then she craned her head up high to look at the sky. "I think that's further than I can fly, Milo," she said. "But I do have a way to see the moon up close without flying very far at all. It's called a telescope." When Milo looked through the telescope, he got a really good look at the moon. "Oh," said Milo. "It really isn't made of cheese after all." "Nope," said the owl. "It's made of rocks." "Well, where am I going to get some cheese?" Milo cried as he realized his misunderstanding. The owl moved the telescope with her wing, and Milo continued to look. "Oh my goodness," he said. "A cheese store." The owl peeked through the telescope. "It looks like they're having a sale on cheddar," she said.